Right. Just 1 second
Yeah.
and we good to go. There's some issues with Zoom nowadays because many people connecting, so I guess
Mhm.
it's normal for that. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Sorry for the delay. We are having some issues with the Zoom application. However, I'm very proud to have once again my friend Dr. Sampath Sarao from India and her assistant, which is Dr. Kavita Parashak Palet. Good afternoon, everyone. So, good afternoon, Sampath. Good afternoon, ma'am. So today it's very important to us because we decided to have a panel on anatomic dissection and starting from scratch from the basic procedure to reaching the infratemporal fossa type A. This is going to be the first videos of a series. I've requested Dr. Sampath to take care of these issues and he will have his her assistant to help him. So, how are you?
I'm good, Puya. It's always a pleasure to do things together with you. We've been great friends, and once again, this is I think this is the second webinar we're doing together. So congratulations to you for putting up a great show. You've done a lot of topics. You've covered a lot of topics over the last 1 year. Nasusano is going really well, and it's making great connections across the world. And most importantly, congratulations on coming out of COVID, and you're not a COVID survivor, so you're precious.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. So let's go straight to the presentation because today, due to the fact that we cannot perform a live dissection course, however, we will have some beautiful videos and our colleagues will introduce every step and explain every step to perform a correct and safely infratemporal fossa type A. So, do you have your presentation ready?
Already, Puyam. So let me begin by thanking Puya for the opportunity. And me and Puya go a long way back in association during our times in Italy. Puya is a fantastic guy personally and professionally as well. And having trained under the Italian group in anterior skull base and lateral skull base with Paulo Castelnuovo, and also with us at Mario, Puya is an accomplished skull base surgeon. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful association thus far, and thanks once again for the opportunity. So the topic today will be infratemporal fossa approaches, and we will try to stick to the basics of infratemporal fossa without really expanding onto the subject, because I know that a lot of people, even for the experienced surgeons, dissectors, this is an area, this is a piece of real estate that's quite expensive and difficult to master. So we will begin with with a brief history of skull base surgery and infratemporal fossa approaches. Then we go on to the indication, surgical anatomy, and then which will be done by Dr. Kavita, who is my colleague and who works with me in my institutions. And I will then step in to describe the surgical approaches, and I will finish it with going by going through a dissection video. So that's the agenda for today. I don't think we'll be able to complete all the infratemporal fossa approaches. We will try to finish the most important one, that's type A. And as Puya said, so type B, C, and D can probably be clubbed to into one seminar, which we will be having soon once we decide when that's going to be. So I present to you Dr. Kavita Prakash Paled, who is a consultant ENT surgeon working in Bangalore and trained in various centers. So Kavita will be presenting the initial discussions on infratemporal fossa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sampath Rao, sir. Thank you, Nasusana Group, for giving me the opportunity to present about the infratemporal fossa indications and surgical anatomy. So, shall I start?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Can you share a presentation? You want to just go ahead by
Yes,
teaching?
now,
Yeah,
yes.
go
So,
ahead.
we will share the screen, but now I'm getting this message saying host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Yes, I'm enabling right now, so you'll be able right now to do it.
Great, perfect.
So, coming to the history of infratemporal fossa approaches, a renowned pioneer, that is Charles A. Balance, who was a surgeon who get well versed with the otology and neuro otology field. He said some two quotes about the skull base surgery. That is, in ancient atlases, that is Hind Sun Cleans, these lands were called as unexplored land, and this was called as a surgical terra incognita, that is unknown land which was not explored because of its danger lying in danger lying in the anatomical structures. So he said that lies in not removing the disease but leaving it there. So our responsibility is to remove the disease completely, uh, disease completely, but this is the area which is situated in close relationship to the several important structures, which much must be left intact if best results are to be obtained, but sometimes we need to injure it to remove the disease completely. So in 1920, so these were the two legends who taught us the pathway to the skull-base surgery. That is Dr. Harvey William Cushings and Walter Danday, who introduced many skull-base approaches. Most commonly, the posterior approach to the jugular foramina area, and also they introduced the silver clips to the hemostasis of the vessels, and also the electrocautery for the purpose of hemostasis. And Walter Dandy, he excised acoustic neuroma in his time 1920 by it's the acoustic neuroma of the CP angle area, and also he cut the vestibular neuronectomy in Meniere's disease. So these were followed by many legends, pioneers in skull-base surgery. Dr. William House, Dr. Hitzelberg, these both were known as a neuro-otologist. So they introduced the auditory brainstem implant, as well as they introduced the translabyrinthine approach, as well as the middle fossa approaches. And Gaji M. Yasser-Gill, who was a well-known modern who was known as a well-known modern neurosurgeon who introduced the frontotemporal-spinoidotomy. And Majid Sami, who was a neurosurgeon who introduced who gave a contribution to the skull-base approaches, as well as in the radiology, interventional radiology of the skull base. And Hugo Fish, I am going to tell about his history further. And Dr. Mario Sana is a pioneer in a skull base and otology. He is a director in Grupo Otologico. Uh, so coming to the history of infratemporal fossa approaches, it started with the area of glomus jugular region. So in 1941, the Stacy Rufus Guild, so he found out some vascular tumors occupying the different area of the temporal bone region, most commonly in the jugular fossa region. So he also noticed that the blood supply was from the anterior tympanic branch of ascending pharyngeal artery. And he also saw that so this was arising from the glomus jugular. He named this structure as glomus jugularis, which was changed to glomus jugular because there was a mistake in the word jugularis, a Latin word mistake. So they changed it to glomus jugular. So in 1942, Harry Rosenwasser from the Mount Sinai Hospital from New York, so he saw a mass originating from the middle ear, which was extending to the external auditory canal. And he saw that these tumors were bleeding, and it was looking like a carotid body tumor. which was so this gave him interest to study about these tumors and study about the approaches of extratemporal as well as extratemporal approaches to the jugular foramen and the skull base. So he developed the algorithm for this management of the tumor. If there are small tumors involving the tympanic region, so transtympanic approach he used, and if it was involving the mastoid region, he used the mastoidectomy approach. If it was extending into the from the jugular foramen into the intracranial regions, he used the extended wide local excision with the control of the neck vessels. So after following that, there was an incomplete removal of these tumors, and further the patients were subjected to radiotherapy. So this led to the incomplete removal of the tumor. Further, 1952, the CAPS discovered a subtotal excision of the glomus with one of the technique which is well known now for infratemporal fossa A approach, that is rerouting of the facial nerve. And 1953, there is a sign called Brown's sign was introduced by Brown. So that is increasing the pressure in the external auditory canal, which blanches this pulsatile tumor. So coming to Gejrot, who did the retrograde jugulography study of the jugular bulb as well as the jugular vein, and he saw and he used many techniques like closing the jugular bulb, closing the internal carotid artery, and using the Sergi cells to control the bleeding. So many techniques he used. Along with that, he also used one technique very importantly, which is followed till now, is the sparing of the medial wall of the jugular bulb, because it encompasses the lower cranial nerve. So 1964, the Shapiro and US described the skull base approaches, which includes mainly the IJV ligation and the facial nerve rerouting. So in 1968, House and Glasscock, who introduced the posterior tympanotomy approach to remove the glomus tympanicum. So Hugo Fish, so he by the time in early 1970s, so he got three basic things. One is the ligation of the IJV, one is the facial nerve rerouting, and he also got, along with the working with the Gaji Jurich, the neurosurgeon, he got an idea of, so these areas can be accessed by the removal of the bone of that region. So all three things he included in his this thing. So he decided, he paid attention for removal of the complete removal of the jugular foramina tumors, and he classified the glomus tumors into different classifications, though, so they occupy the different anatomical regions, and he introduced according to that the infratemporal approaches like type A, B, and C, which I'll be dealing in the next further slides. So Glasscock and Jackson, who distinguished the tympanicum from the jugular. In 1987, Osama Al-Mefti, who proposed the single stage combined intracranial and extracranial resection of the intradural tumors. So according to Hugo Fish classification, the infratemporal fossa has been divided into A, B, C, and D. So coming to infratemporal fossa type A approach, the regions which can be accessed through this approach is the jugular foramina, infralabyrinthine region, apical part of the petrous bone, vertical segment of the internal carotid artery, upper jugulocarotic space, and primarily it is used this one for the extradural lesions. So the key in this removal of these tumors occupying this region was the anterior transposition of the facial nerve to provide adequate control in this region. So coming to the pictorial representation, so this is the jugular bulb area with the lower cranial nerves in the jugular foramina. This area can be accessed: jugulocarotico region, cervical part of the carotid, infralabyrinthine area, and the petrous apex area. So all these regions were accessed with the anterior repositioning of the facial nerve. You can see the facial nerve which is anteriorly repositioned in the root of sarcoma. So Coming to the surgical anatomy. So before knowing the indication, we should know the surgical anatomy. Um, so so in the first picture, you can see the facial nerve. So after cortical mastoidectomy, the canal wall down as well. After that, the facial canal is delineated and the nerve is exposed from the geniculate ganglion till the stylomastoid foramina. So this nerve and to the jugular bulb, what is the relationship? So in 60% of the cases, this jugular bulb lies anterior to the facial nerve canal. So this is very important landmark while in the infratemporal fossa A approach. And coming to this picture, so this shows the anterior repositioning after we delineate from the geniculate ganglion to the stylomastoid foramina. We have anteriorly repositioned. So after that, once we go to the jugular bulb, we'll come to the cranial nerves exit from the skull base. So what is the surgical anatomy of these cranial nerves? So first one is lateral most is the accessory nerve, and medial most cranial nerve is the hypoglossal nerve. So lateral most is the glossopharyngeal nerve, and medial most is the hypoglossal nerve. So glossopharyngeal nerve, once it exists from the skull base, it directly acutely turns and crosses the internal carotid artery, and the hypoglossal nerve, which runs along the vagus nerve, and inferiorly it crosses the internal carotid artery, whereas accessory nerve, which crosses the internal jugular vein, and it runs posterior medial to the internal jugular vein, and the vagus nerve, which runs in between the internal carotid artery and internal jugular vein. But surface anatomy, it shows first nerve we will encounter will be the accessory nerve. As we dissect, we'll encounter the accessory nerve, then internal jugular vein, then hypoglossal nerve, and last will be the glossopharyngeal nerve. So another anatomy is the occipital artery, which arises from the external carotid artery, which takes a turn and crosses the internal jugular vein, and it passes laterally to the internal jugular vein and accessory nerve. And this is one of the pictorial diagram, so dissecting this thing, showing once again the cranial nerves, and the jugular bulb, which turns laterally and enter the neck as an internal jugular vein, whereas internal carotid artery turns medially, it becomes the cervical part enters the skull base. So as you can see, this is the internal jugular vein, and this is the accessory nerve, which runs posterior medially to the internal jugular vein. You can also see the vertebral artery here. So whenever the tumors extending beyond jugular foramina into the neck, so it can extend into till the vertebral artery also. So coming to this picture, so in this picture, in these two pictures, it indicates there are some structures lateral to the vascular structures in the neck. So those are from lateral to medial, the styloid process, posterior belly of digastric muscle, then a facial nerve, and sternocleidomastoid. So whenever there is extensive glomus tumors involving the neck region, sometimes these structures, which are I described from lateral to medial, need to be sacrificed or anteriorly repositioned to gain access to this region. So this completes the surgical anatomy of type A approach. So indications are, so type C and type D glomus jugular tumors. That is type C is the tumors involving the carotid canal. And also D is the intracranial extension. It can be intradural or the extradural. And lower cranial, so jugular foramen is nothing but the venous as well as the neural region. So the nerve schwannomas are also can be excised, and meningiomas of the jugular foramen. So lesions of the infralabyrinthine and apical compartments of the temporal bone, such as cholesteatoma, lower clival chondromas, extensive facial neuromas. And some of the soft tissue tumors also can be excised, like rhabdomyosarcoma, cholesterol granuloma, myxoma, adenoid cystic carcinoma, and skull base osteomyelitis, and carotid aneurysm, glomus caroticum, and ceruminoma. Coming to infratemporal type B approach. So in this approach, it is an extra labyrinthine approach, which is mainly designed for the petrous apex and clival region. So in A approach, we completed the tympanic bone part, and now we are further going in further regions. So can you see these pictures? So we were confined to this area in the previous approach. So now we are extending further to include the petrous bone, that is petrous apex, as well as the clival bone. So you can see in this picture the surgical anatomy of the temporal fossa B approach. So coming to the petrous apex, so this is the pyramidal shape bone which lies posteromedially in the skull base, whose base is formed by the cochlea and the anterior wall of the internal auditory meatus, and anteriorly by the Gasserian ganglion. And the anterior wall is dehiscent, but and it is anteromedially it is occupied by the petrous part of the internal carotid artery. And there is one fissure in between the clivus and the petrous apex, is petro-occipital fissure. So which has a dense fibrous tissue in that. Along with that, it has a inferior petrosal sinus, so which divides the petrous apex from the mid-clival region. So mainly in this approach, so we have to know the bony components and the important vascular and neural components. So which is the vascular component is the petrous part of the internal carotid artery, which has two parts. One is vertical part and the horizontal part. So vertical part is about 5 mm in length, and longest will be the horizontal part. So how we can expose this internal carotid artery? So what are the landmarks? So structures which lie lateral to medial to this internal carotid artery are, one is the glenoid fossa. Next one is the middle meningeal artery from the foramina spinosum, and mandibular nerve from the foramina ovale, and the eustachian tube. So whenever we drill these structures from lateral to medially, so we can directly see this petrous part of the carotid artery. So coming to indication, so the lesions involving the petrous apex are cholesteatoma, cholesterogranuloma, epidermoid cyst, glial cyst, mucosal cyst, chondrosarcoma. And clival lesions includes chordoma, chondrosarcoma, and extensive glomus lesions involving the clivus. So other lesions, other rare lesions involving the eustachian tube area, such as choristoma, melanoma, and some of the hemangiomas. So coming to infratemporal fossa C approach. So it is once again the anterior extension of the type B approach. So what was the difference between type B and C is, so we can see here the pterygoid plate. So we confine the B approach till its posterior border. But in C approach, approach, what we will do is we have to extend this line to include this pterygoid plate, so pterygoid process, then sphenoid sinus area, and the clival area, and the part of the cavernous sinus. So this is the anterior extension of the type B approach, where the pterygoid process is drilled, providing the control of the important areas, that is nasopharynx, pterygopalatine fossa, and sphenoid sinus. So it indicates it gives access to infratemporal fossa, pterygopalatine fossa, sphenoid sinus, and minimal extension into the cavernous sinus. So what is the surgical anatomy here? So here, this is the infratemporal fossa, which is bounded laterally by the ramus of the mandible, and medially by the lateral pterygoid plate, above by the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. So along with that, this is a pterygopalatine fossa, anteriorly by the palatine bone, and posteriorly by the pterygoid plate, above by the greater wing of the sphenoid. So all these regions are accessed by one important bony landmark here, that is pterygoid process. So this pterygoid process has two plates, so medial pterygoid plate and the lateral pterygoid plate. So pterygoid process and the medial pterygoid plate form the lateral wall of the omer, lateral wall of the choana, and it is related laterally to the omer. And foramen ovale, so pterygoid process is related anterior to the foramen ovale. Coming to the pterygoid fossa, this pterygopalatine fossa, this pterygoid process as well as the medial pterygoid plate forms the posterior boundary of the pterygopalatine fossa. Through this approach, we get the posterior control of the pterygopalatine fossa. Along with the infratemporal fossa, pterygopalatine fossa, we'll get a control over this neural structures. So these are the foramina. So this is foramina lacerum, this is foramina ovale, this is foramina rotundum. So where foramina ovale, mandibular nerve, foramina rotundum, so maxillary nerve. And anteriorly it is supraorbital fissures, which has the third, fourth, and fifth and sixth nerve. But we have control here in this region, pterygoid process region. So coming to the some more relation to the pterygoid process. So this pterygoid process superomedially is the sphenoid sinus. So this is one region we can access. When we drill this pterygoid process and medial pterygoid plate, we end up in nasopharynx, where we can see the perpendicular plate of omer bone. And when we drill from laterally the greater wing of sphenoid, so we can enter this infratemporal fossa area, where we can encounter middle meningeal artery, and this is the foramina ovale with the mandibular nerve. After sacrificing all these things, we get the V2, that is maxillary nerve. So it indicates foramina rotundum. So it indicates we are in the posterior aspect of the pterygopalatine fossa. And also the internal carotid artery with the genu region we can access. So come and some of the muscles, if we remove in this region, so we will get a greater access. That is lateral pterygoid muscle, which has its origin from the greater wing of sphenoid, and the medial lamellae of the lateral pterygoid plate, which inserts into the mandibular condyle, and medial pterygoid plate, which originates from the pterygoid fossa, as well as the medial lamella of the lateral pterygoid plate, and insertion into the ramus. So this medial pterygoid muscle, which give a differentiation bit from the parapharyngeal space and the infratemporal fossa. So when we cut this nerve, we will get access to the infratemporal fossa, parapharyngeal space also. So what are the indications? Mainly this infratemporal fossa C was for the nasopharyngeal carcinomas, and also the tumors of the infratemporal fossa, and the peritubal tumors such as cylindroma, adenoid cystic carcinoma, and the nasopharyngeal persistent or recurrent post-irradiation nasopharyngeal carcinomas, and juvenile nasopharyngeal angiofibroma involving the pterygopalatine and ITF, that is type C type of tumor. And some of the soft tissue tumors like rhabdosarcoma, chordoma, plasmacytoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and as I said, parapharyngeal space can also be accessed. So the tumors involving that regions are pleomorphic adenoma and teratoma. So coming to infratemporal D approach. So here once again we extend our line. So anteriorly to involve this zygomatic region and the posterior part of the maxillary bone, and superiorly to involve the cavernous part of the internal carotid artery, cavernous sinus region, as well as the clival region. So areas, so type C approach was mainly performed through the type D approach, mainly performed by the preauricular incision, where the mastoid bone was not addressed. So that is mastoidectomy is not performed, and middle ear left intact. So eustachian tube is not sacrificed in this approach. So it is mainly designed for the infratemporal fossa approaches, which is extending to the cavernous sinus and the clival region, less extension into the pterygopalatine and the sphenoid region, and also the paracellular region. So coming to other preauricular approaches, temporal approach, that is infratemporal transzygomatic approach, where we do a craniotomy, means craniotomy of the bone, so that we can access the paracellular as well as the cavernous sinus region. So coming to the surgical anatomy in this region. So in this region, as we take in third picture, so as we take a preauricular incision, we should know about the layers in this region. So first will be the superficial temporal fascia, which has important superficial temporal vessels and frontal branch of facial nerve in that, and the deep temporal fascia, which divides into the outer thick as well as inner thick fascia, which houses the superficial temporal pad of fat, which is avascular structure. So this fascia inserts into the zygomatic process and continues along the masseter region. Here also it gives a control over the facial nerve while dissection. And this is a temporalis muscle which will cut and reflect anteriorly. So coming to the internal carotid artery of this region, because as initially we have mentioned that we can access the cavernous sinus. This is the genu area, so which is related to the cochlea, which is about 1 to 5 millimeter distance from the genu, and the geniculate ganglion is also related to the genu of the internal carotid artery. As you can see here, inferior petrosal sinus, superior petrosal sinus. So this petrous apex divides. So inferior petrosal sinus, which divides the petrous apex into the clival region. So so after dissecting almost all the bone, so we will approach after the genu area, when once we come in the clival region. So there this petrous part of the internal carotid artery becomes the goes along the lacerum and becomes the cavernous part of the internal carotid artery, which has the two vertical limbs and one horizontal limb and two genus. And this you can see the Gazerian ganglion, which is giving V2, V3 and V1. So this indicates we are in the cavernous sinus region, and we can access to the sphenoid sinus area, that is paras, and also the paracellular region here. And some of the other that is third nerve and the fourth nerve is going to the supraorbital fissure here. So this is the abducent nerve, which is going to the Dorellos canal in the petrous apex, crossing the internal carotid artery. So coming to the indications here, so lesions involving mainly the infratemporal and middle fossa with or without extension into the petrous apex, sphenoid sinus, sphenopalatine fossa and cavernous sinus. Mainly the trigeminal neuromas, which are dumbbell shaped, and meningiomas with paracellular involvement with or without extracranial involvement, and extensive nasopharyngeal angiofibroma with or without cavernous sinus involvement, and tumors involving the Meckel's cave. So thank you. This completes the wide history and indications, as well as the types and indications and the surgical anatomy in this region. So further, the stepwise dissection will be dealt by Dr. Sampath Chandra Prasad Rao sir. So thank you so much.
Okay, so that was part one. I'm going to stop sharing screen here for a minute, so I load my presentation.
No worries.
Yes. Do you think we can take some questions meanwhile? I have just 1 minute if you think it's okay. Or shall I go ahead with my presentation?
It's if you already have it, we will go for the questions at the end of the talk.
Okay, done. So I'm sharing my screen. And yes, so that's what we're going to discuss today. So the infratemporal fossa approaches. Now there are two foci for a ENT skull-based surgeon. There are a lot of neurosurgeons out there as well, wanting to master the skull-based territory. But of the transtemporal approaches, there are two foci. One is the translabyrinthine approach to cerebellopontine angle, and then the other focus is on the infratemporal fossa approach to the infratemporal fossa. Okay, so Kavita has quite lucidly discussed the history, surgical anatomy, indications, and now we'll go into the stepwise anatomical dissections of each of these approaches. And as I told you, I don't think we'll be able to cover all the approaches in one day, just like how we cannot learn all of skull base surgery in one day. But we'll try to do justice to at least one of the approaches today, and then the rest of them will probably be done in due course. So we're going to deal with the infratemporal fossa type A approach in detail today. So I begin most of my dissection presentations by saying, by quoting William Harvey, who during his time in the 1600s was a master physician and a master scientist, dissector, and he very famously said in his book or his masterpiece on the circulatory system of the human body, in the masterpiece titled De Motu Cordis, which means which roughly translate to anatomical dissections in Latin. I profess to learn and to teach anatomy not from books but from dissections, not from the tenets of philosophers but from the very fabric of nature. So these are very strong words, and I can emphasize it again and again, that if skull-based surgery is what you're after, if that's your passion, and unless it's a passion, I don't think one can really master skull-based, because it's a long journey, it's difficult terrain, and if this is an area you want to master, you want to learn about and do surgeries in, then you need to get to dissect. So you can listen to presentations like this, you can read books, but that will not help you navigate yourself through your surgeries. So I implore, urge, and request all of you to spend your time dissecting bones, dissecting cadaveric specimens, and preparing yourself for any eventuality that your surgical adventures may offer you with. So we're dealing with this territory called the infratemporal fossa. I told Puya Degani that this is prime real estate territory. You see, there's a reason for that. It's an area that has obviously a bony territory, and then it has arteries, it has veins, and it has a lot of nerves. So what are we looking at? I just briefly touched upon this slide yesterday as well during my webinar on the anatomy of skull base, and I told you that the infratemporal fossa is the space between the skull base. This is the base of the skull, and we're looking at it from below. So superiorly there is the base of the skull, and medially there is the lateral pharyngeal wall, and laterally we have the ascending ramus of the mandible and the condyle of the mandible, which sits into the glenoid fossa. So we are looking at a space that's here. This is infratemporal fossa. Okay, so this is infratemporal. A part of the infratemporal, the posterior part of the infratemporal fossa kind of leads us into more complex areas of the petrous bone. Okay, but per se, this is the area we're looking at, and it lies posterolateral to the maxillary sinus, communicates with the temporal fossa here via the space deep to the zygomatic arch. This area is not too significant unless we're looking at giant cell tumors, which are generally focused around the greater wing of sphenoid. It communicates, so the infratemporal fossa communicates with the pterygopalatine fossa via the pterygomaxillary fissure. In this area, more a territory to be dealt with by anterior skull base surgery, and not so much purely by the lateral approach. And posterior inferiorly it opens into the neck. It continues the infratemporal fossa, continues as a parapharyngeal space, and an anatomical structure that demarcates the infratemporal fossa from the parapharyngeal space is the medial pterygoid muscle. So again, we're looking at this area now. Okay, so the infratemporal fossa, again, you see this is the skull base here. Medially we have the lateral pharyngeal wall. The ascending ramus of the mandible has been removed to open up and show the space. The pterygomaxillary fissure, the pterygopalatine fossa, is where the infratemporal fossa communicates anteriorly, and then from there on we get into the nose. and inferiorly it opens down into the neck. So what are some of the structures that we can identify here? Again, the tympanic bone. You see, this tympanic bone for me is the gateway to lateral skull base surgery. This is a small bone, but it's located in a very, very crucial junction between the temporal bone and the infratemporal fossa. So this has to be dealt with, removed a lot of times for us to get into more deeper areas. Now this is the zygomatic arch. The zygoma bone is here, and this is the glenoid fossa formed by the zygoma, and here you have the greater wing of sphenoid, and this is the suture line between the tympanic bone and the sphenoid bone. This here is the spine of the sphenoid. Now, again, going back to the boundaries, medially, the infratemporal fossa is bound by the lateral pterygoid plate. This one here, the tensor veli palatine muscles, the levator veli palatini muscles, the superior constrictor muscles, which are all muscular attachments to the base of the skull. Laterally, again, the ramus of the mandible and the condyle process of the mandible, which the articular surface of which sits in the glenoid fossa. Anteriorly, the posterior wall of the maxillary sinus. Superiorly, it merges with the temporal fossa under the arch of the zygoma. The floor is the medial pterygoid muscle, below which the infratemporal fossa continues as the parapharyngeal space. The roof, of course, we discussed, is formed by the greater wing of sphenoid, which has a foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, etc. Now, infratemporal fossa. One of the most important pivotal areas of the infratemporal fossa is the jugular foramen and the areas adjacent to the jugular foramen. So this is in frank infratemporal fossa. This is what the anatomists would call infratemporal fossa. Now, diseases do not limit themselves by our definitions, our anatomical definitions. So if there is a tumor, and the most common tumor of the jugular foramen is a paraganglioma. If there's a paraganglioma that arises from the jugular foramen, it will spread into these areas, into the petrous areas, mastoid areas, into the tympanic areas, and into the infratemporal fossa. So we need to, in infratemporal fossa type A, we not only deal with the infratemporal fossa per se, but we also deal with the petrous and the occipital regions of the temporal bone. We go a little more posterior in our anatomical territory. So if you want to master the infratemporal fossa, the pivotal point is the jugular foramen. Now, this is the area we need to talk about in great detail. Yesterday, we just touched upon it. We just briefly glossed upon these areas, and we went through the anatomy of these areas. But we are going to, this entire presentation will be focused on the areas around the jugular foramen. Now, broadly, you see that there are 4 bones. One is a temporal bone, which has the petrous portion, the tympanic portions here, the mastoid portions, the occipital bone. All this is occipital bone, including the clivus, and then we have the greater wing of sphenoid. Okay, so this is the greater wing of sphenoid. So the petrous portions of the temporal bone is perched between the greater wing of sphenoid and the occipital bone, including the clivus, the occipital condyle, the jugular process, mastoid areas, and other areas. Okay, so now again, what do you mean by going for the jugular, and what do you mean by discussing the jugular foramen? You need to understand that the jugular foramen area has 3 important structures before you get into this one cavity that you think is the jugular foramen. There are a lot of nuances and a lot of interesting aspects to this foramen. It's just not an entry point into a vein. There are a lot of important structures which you need to identify in your dissection specimens and later on when you operate on live patients as well. So what are the 3 important structures? The first structure is the jugular process. The next structure that we're going to discuss is the jugular tubercle. And the third structure that we're going to discuss today is the jugular spine. So if you understand what's the jugular process, the jugular tubercle, and the jugular spine, you understand the bony aspects of the jugular foramen. So now let's get into the jugular process. Before that, I'll just read this out. The jugular process is a quadrilateral or triangular process of the occipital bone, not the petrous bone, the occipital bone on each side that articulates, that's between the mastoid tip or the digastric ridge and the occipital condyle. So this is the area we are looking at. This is called the jugular process. Sometimes there is a frank process. There is a frank protuberance that lies between the digastric ridge or the medial aspects of the mastoid process and the occipital condyle. Why is this important? Because if you're going to follow a jugular foramen tumor, you have to be prepared in the lateral. And today we're going to discuss only the transtemporal approaches. That is, the infratemporal fossa type A is a transtemporal approach. We are not discussing the retrosigmoid suboccipital and the far lateral approaches to the jugular foramen. Now, these are very broad areas. We can go on and on. One area always leads to another interesting area. Another interesting area leads to another interesting. The whole of the skull base is so terribly interesting that you just can't stop discussing enough. But today we are going to try to focus on these areas here, and the topic now is the jugular process. So jugular process is a quadrilateral or a triangular piece of bone, as one would see it, that lies between the mastoid process and the occipital condyle. This is from the undersurface of the skull base. Now, if you look at this from the inside, or the intracranial view of the jugular process would appear something like this. Again, intracranially, it extends from, this is the area of the sigmoid sinus, and the transverse sinus goes here, the sigmoid sinus, and then sigmoid sinus goes into the jugular foramen, the vascular compartment of the jugular foramen. So just medial to the sigmoid sinus, jugular-sigmoid angle, you get the lateral boundary of the jugular process, and it roughly corresponds to the suture line between the occipital bone and the mastoid bone, and then all the way medially up to the jugular tubercle. Okay, so this is, and I'll tell you what the jugular tubercle is later, but this here is the area of the jugular tubercle. So this area is has to be drilled out from lateral to medial if you are to go all the way up to the hypoglossal canal, and a lot of paragangliomas, jugular foramen paragangliomas, jugular foramen tumors, jugular foramen meningiomas often go all the way up to the hypoglossal canal. And this here is the hypoglossal canal. No, this is not the hypoglossal canal. This is the occipital condyle. The posterior condylar vein goes through the occipital condyle. Anyway, so this is the jugular process. Now, looking at it laterally, and when you are dissecting a bone, what's your navigation path? You have to remove the mastoid process to be able to see the jugular process. Okay, so the mastoid process is drilled out, and then you get to see the jugular process here. Looking at it from a more lateral perspective, or a more posterolateral perspective, you can now appreciate what I'm talking about. The mastoid process is clearly seen here. The seventh cranial, the facial nerve is here. And then there is another protuberance or process that lies between the mastoid process and the occipital condyle. Now, this is not purely lateral. That's why I said this is a posterolateral view. So it's not really true that it's in one straight line like this. So you've turned the head nicely, posteriorly and laterally, to be able to get these three in one straight line. It's actually much more from lateral to medial. Okay. Now, if this is the occipital condyle, what does it articulate with? The occipital condyle articulates with the atlas. So this is the atlanto-occipital joint, and can you just put this one? Yeah. So this is the atlanto-occipital joint, and this is the atlas, the lateral process of the C1, and then you have all the vertebral artery anatomy, posterior and lateral to the to these areas. So the jugular process also gives attachment to a muscle called the rectus capitis lateralis. So this muscle has to be drilled out or cut a section before you drill all the way up to the occipital condyle in search of your hypoglossal canal. Now, if you look at these pictures, it may look a little confusing. It may look like it's something like a potpourri, but it's, for those of you who are a little bit more familiar, I would call out to all those people who have attended the World Skull Base Fellowship Diplomas to look carefully into some of these dissection pictures. Now, let's begin with this. we are looking at a lateral view of the suboccipital area. We are looking at the lateral view of the jugular area, and this is obvious. Let's begin with the most easily identifiable structure, that's the internal jugular vein. So the internal jugular vein always lies just anterior to the transverse process of C1. Now, this is the transverse process of C1. So this is the bony protuberance of the transverse process of C1. Just anterior to the transverse process of C1 is where you find the internal jugular vein. Medial to the internal jugular vein, you have the 9th, 10th, 11th cranial nerves, into carotid artery, and all these structures. Now, this is, we'll begin from this point, transverse process of C1, the arch. So the vertebral artery goes through this arch, and we're not going to discuss the vertebral artery anatomy at this point. So let's go back to where we began. Now, we have removed the mastoid tip here. The entire suboccipital bone has been removed. This is an elastic clip that is retracting the vein here. So this is now, so once the mastoid tip has been removed, what lies between the jugulo-sigmoid junction? The sigmoid sinus is here. The jugular bulb is deeper, and this is the internal jugular vein. So somewhere in this area, deeper, medially, is the jugular bulb. And what lies now after drilling out the mastoid tip, and medial to the mastoid tip and lateral to the jugular foramen, or the jugular bulb itself, is the jugular process, is a thick piece of bone called the jugular process. You'll have to drill this, and you have to drill this to be actually able to see the okay, cut it. So to be actually be able to see the jugular bulb as such. Okay, so this is the importance of the jugular process. The reason why I'm drawing your attention to the jugular process is because one needs to actually drill out. I've seen a lot of people doing infratemporal fossa approaches. I've seen, I've been to many centers, and a lot of people doing a lot of presentations in infratemporal fossa approaches. Remember, infratemporal fossa approach is not just about exposing the jugular bulb retrofacially and then nibbling out or removing pieces of tumor from the jugular bulb. If you leave behind this jugular process laterally, you have not completed your dissection, and it is for certain that you would leave behind tumor inside in the deeper aspects of the jugular foramen. Okay, so I've seen a lot of people close the sigmoid, close the IJV, preserve the entire jugular process, debulk tumor in the jugular bulb area, and then say that they've removed tumor. It doesn't work that way, because unless you remove the jugular process, you will not be able to see the lateral wall of the jugulosigmoid complex. Now, this is a little more complex, but I see, obviously we're dealing with complex areas, so there's no point in being apologetic about these things. You have to catch the bull by its horns. So now let's look at the jugular process in a slightly different way. Now, we go back to this picture here, and this is the occipital condyle, isn't it? So the jugular process ends at the occipital condyle. So if you're looking at it laterally again, and we go past the jugular bulb, okay, so this is, here there is the jugular bulb and the process intact. Now I've removed the jugular process, removed the jugular bulb, and then if I look intracranially, what we can do is to compartmentalize the occipital condyle into 3 stories. This is the first story, this is the middle story, this is the lower story. Okay, let's begin at the lower story because it's easy to understand. So what I'm saying is, what I'm focusing is on this area from inferior to superior. So what attaches itself to the occipital condyle here? The atlas, isn't it? The atlanto-occipital joint is here. So the lowest compartment corresponds to the occipital bone, occipital condyle, and the C1, so atlanto-occipital joint, okay, and the vertebral artery anatomy. So the lower compartment corresponds to the atlanto-occipital. The middle compartment corresponds to the jugular process, the occipital condylar vein, and the intracranial compartments. Now, let's go to this picture here. Again, this is the occipital condyle C1 and the vertebral artery. Here, the jugular process is intact. Here, the jugular process has been removed. And only if you remove the jugular process, if you remove the jugular process here, and here. If you remove this process, and if you remove this process, here will you be able to see the hypoglossal canal? Okay, so this is the moot point here today. Okay, if you want to complete the infratemporal fossa approach, you need to encounter the hypoglossal canal. So how do you encounter? So that's why I said, if you keep or leave behind the jugular process, if you leave behind this bone, if you leave behind this bone and do only a mastodectomy, go inside from above, go a retrofacial, reroute the facial, and then go from above, nibble the tumor and come, you're not going to be able to access these areas, and you're not going to go so deep as the hypoglossal canal. And mind you, when you're talking about the hypoglossal canal, you're fairly deep in the infratemporal fossa real estate territory. Okay, so this area is the jugular process, and the hypoglossal canal corresponds to the middle compartment. So what lies above? What lies above? The jugular tubercle. Okay, so that's where we go to the next point of discussion. So we're coming now to the jugular tubercle. So the jugular process is complete. The jugular tubercle is now what we're talking about. Now, where is the jugular tubercle? The jugular tubercle is more described or experienced or seen from the intracranial aspect of the skull base. So we're looking at this from above. Now we look at the foramen magnum. Okay, this is this protuberance that's bordering the lateral aspect of the foramen magnum is the jugular tubercle. So this and these are the jugular tubercles. Now, if you're looking at the right side, again intracranially, this is the this thing for the sigmoid sinus, jugulosigmoid sinus. So I spoke about this yesterday. This is the posterior petrous face, petrous bone, anteriorly sphenoid, posteriorly occipital bone. So this is the petrous apex, the very tip. What are the structures that you see in the internal aortic canal? Endolymphatic sac depression, sigmoid sinus, posterior petrous ridge, along which runs the superior petrosal sinus, internal aortic meatus. Now this is the jugular foramen, isn't it? So this is the jugular foramen. Jugular foramen and all these areas jugular process, you drill and then you come to the jugular tubercle. So when you go back to this picture, you'll realize that you'll have to drill the jugular process completely to reach the jugular tubercle, which is here now. I didn't show that to you earlier, but now you see the upper compartment, the first story of the three stories of the area of the occipital condyle. So the upper story has the jugular tubercle, the middle story has, and the jugular tubercle, the 9th, 10th, and the 11th cranial nerves kind of drape themselves over the jugular tubercle. The middle story has the jugular process and the 12th, the hypoglossal canal. The third compartment, the lower story, has the occipital condyle, atlant occipital joint, vertebral arteries. Okay. So now we are talking about the middle compartment, that is here, the jugular tubercle, and the hypoglossal canal. The middle compartment is jugular, the middle compartment, the hypoglossal canal, jugular process. So jugular process and the hypoglossal canal middle. This is the upper compartment. Okay, we look at the upper compartment, jugular tubercle upper, hypoglossal canal, and the jugular process middle. And lower down, you have the atlant occipital joint, which is nothing but the occipital condyle area. So again, jugular tubercle is here. Jugular tubercle is here. Now this is with the cranial nerves. Okay, so we are looking at a posterior superior view of the skull base with the brain removed, obviously. We have the vertebral arteries joining to form the basilar artery. Okay, so this is the sigmoid sinus jugular bulb area. Okay, and then we have the jugular tubercle, which is here. Okay, so this area is now the area of the jugular process, and you see the 9th, 10th, and the 11th cranial nerve medial to the jugular bulb and kind of draping over the tubercle, and just medial and inferior to the tubercle itself is the hypoglossal middle area, middle compartment. Okay, superior, middle, lower clivus is here. Okay, the occipital condyle is here. So now we are looking again, jugular tubercle upper, middle, hypoglossal canal middle, and the jugular process middle, and lower one will be the occipital condyle. So again, looking at it, so this is the area we're looking at. This is the foramen magnum. This is the jugular tubercle, and there are a lot of studies which actually tell us about the anatomical relationships and the distances between the jugular tubercle and the hypoglossal canal, and from the hypoglossal canal up to the posterior tip of the occipital condyle. Now, again, you see each thing, there are like, ideas just exploding into my head. So I can just talk probably for 20 minutes on this posterior aspect of the jugular condyle. So each thing leads to another, but forgive me for not covering everything today. It's quite impossible for us to, as I told you, learn skull base in a day. So this is the hypoglossal canal that you see when you just, which is medial and inferior to the jugular tubercle. Now, I'm just playing a little bit of a trick with you. So I'm showing you the jugular tubercle now from a lateral view, from an infratemporal fossa type A approach. I'll show it from a translab approach. I'll show it from retrosigmoid approach. So now this is the lateral approach. You have the posterior fossa dura, the sigmoid complex, jugular bulb. So, and then you have the interjugular vein going down here. The jugular process has been completely removed. Now we're going posterolaterally, okay? So this is what is called a transcondylar extension of the infratemporal fossa approach, as described by Professor Mario Sana. So the jugular process is completely removed. Only then you see the hypoglossal canal, and then superiorly is the jugular tubercle. So in this dissection, and if you at some point of time, I'm sure there are a lot of great skull base surgeons, dissectors out there, and this is not for them, but for those of you who are beginning with the basics, if at some point of time during your dissections, not with your visualizations and with your fantasies about skull base, but with your anatomical dissections, with a drill in one hand, suction in the other, and a cadaveric specimen under you, get to a point where you actually see this. The jugular bulb, jugulosigmoid complex, IJV is anterior. Okay, this is the facial nerve here. And then you drill out the entire jugular process. You see the hypoglossal canal, you see the occipital condyle, and if you see a structure like this, you have actually mastered a lot of concepts in lateral skull base. So this is now jugular tubercle. Jugular process has been drilled out, and that is level 2. Level 3 is occipital condyle. Lower down is the atlanto-occipital joint. Now, the jugular tubercle is again seen in a dissection, which is a translabyrinthine approach. Now, this is going to be dealt with in great detail later. The translabyrinthine approach, we have done a translabyrinthine approach. We are seeing the CP angle from laterally. The facial nerve is here. The lower cranial nerves are here. The sigmoid sinus jugular bulb is here. Now we are looking at the jugular tubercle more from a superior direction and intracranial angle, So we're looking at the same jugular tubercle, not from laterally or posterolaterally. We're looking at it from more from the CP angle point of view, from superiorly. So this is the jugular tubercle again, and they're just medial to this, and inferior we have the 12th cranial nerve. So 9th, 10th, 11th is here. The 12th cranial nerve is more medial. So if you encounter the jugular tubercle in your translabyrinthine approach, it is not really wise to keep drilling the jugular tubercle, because then you may get lost and go up to the hypoglossal canal and then thereon into the foramen magnum. Okay, so yes, with a controlled dissection, it is possible for the experts, yes, but for those of you who are doing your first 10, 15, 20 translabyrinthine approach, just try to avoid drilling out the jugular tubercle. Again, so this is a close-up view of this area in another specimen. This is the 9th, 10th, and the 11th cranial nerve. This is not the jugular tubercle, but the jugular tubercle is here behind. Okay, so the jugular bulb will be here. Medial to the jugular bulb, this jugular bulb is covered by bone. Medial to the jugular bulb are the 9th, 10th, and the 11th cranial nerves. And then medial to that is the jugular tubercle. More inframedial to that, to this tubercle, jugular tubercle, is the hypoglossal canal. Now, again, where were we? We were here. So the third aspect that we have to cover is the jugular spine. The jugular spine is important more from a neural preservation point of view. Okay, not from a tumor resection or approach point of view. Now, an approach is to lead you to the tumor. It's a pathway. The wider the approach, the better it is for you in terms of control and dissection and visibility. But the jugular spine, which is a small structure here, is important to be identified for a couple of reasons. I'll talk more about it. Now we're going back to the same this thing. Again, jugular tubercle is here, jugular foramen is here, sigmoid sinus is here. The sigmoid sinus turns as the jugular foramen comes down. From here, it goes as the transverse sinus. This goes intracranial later on. So this is sigmoid sinus, this is jugular foramen. Okay. Now you see a small bony projection in the anterior margin of the jugular foramen. This spine is called the jugular spine. The jugular spine divides the jugular foramen into an anteromedial compartment and a posterolateral compartment. Some people call this petrosal compartment. This is a posterior ovoid compartment, but nevertheless, remember that there is a smaller anteromedial compartment and larger posterior. The smaller compartment is because it has just one nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and a fairly big venous structure, that's the inferior petrosal sinus. So remember, it is here that you have the inferior petrosal sinus and the glossopharyngeal nerve, the 9th nerve. The 10th and the 11th cranial nerve are in the jugular foramen area, along with the jugular bulb. So the jugular bulb is here. Medial to the jugular bulb will be these two other nerves, and the glossopharyngeal nerve per se is in the jugular is in the anteromedial compartment, and this is divided by a supposed to be divided by a fibrous band. Okay, so but most often what happens when there is a tumor, this is destroying these areas and you don't really get to see. Now, why is the jugular spine important? Because radiologically, the presence of a spine differentiates a tumor from a high jugular bulb. Okay, so in a high jugular bulb, the spine is generally preserved, and in any other tumoral etiology, the spine is destroyed and there is expansion of the jugular foramen. Now, this concept is important. Now, this is not important anatomically. Okay, I told you this is important from a preservation point of view. Now, Puya, is everything all right? I'm just doing a check because I've been speaking continuously for some time. Is it all okay?
Great. It's great. Everything is fine.
Perfect. Okay. So now coming on to, now you need to keep this picture in mind, the spine and the fact that it divides the foramen into two areas, because when you're dissecting a tumor, the tumor will be attached to these nerves. And you need to keep this in mind. There won't be, the anatomy will be distorted. You won't have a spine, but you'll need to know how, where, and when to preserve the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus, and the hypoglossal nerves. So again, looking at this from intracranially, you have the spine dividing the jugular foramen into medial compartment and lateral compartment. Again, this is looking at it from inferomedially. The interjugular ridge or spine, whatever you want to call it, divides the. So what the one important structure that is there in the medial anteromedial compartment is the inferior petrosal sinus. Now, again, why is it important for us to identify? So if the inferior petrosal sinus, you know, when you open the jugular bulb, even if you have closed the sigmoid sinus above and the interjugular vein below, the jugular foramen fossa, whatever you want to call it, bleeds because blood comes lateral from medial from the cavernous sinus down through the inferior petrosal sinus. So in your trepidation, I would say, to arrest this bleeding, you tend to pack the inferior petrosal sinus, isn't it? So, and that's an integral part of infratemporal fossa approach. So when you're packing the inferior petrosal sinus, you have to make sure you don't pack the inferior petrosal sinus too hard, because you know that the glossopharyngeal nerve is the other structure that is adjacent to the inferior petrosal sinus. And if you pack the inferior petrosal sinus too vigorously, you will put pressure on the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the glossopharyngeal nerve itself is a fairly thin nerve capable of being injured by your packing. Now, again, for more intricate points, one has to know the, again, mapping in your mind. You need to map in your mind, because this is not easy. This looks all nice and beautiful when there are no musculatures attached to the skull base, but there are, trust me, a million muscles attached to the base of the skull, and you'll need to transect all of them. So this won't be so nice and clear. You'll probably be using different approaches. If you're coming trans-temporal, you'll be inside bone. If you're coming suboccipital, you'll have to section the muscles at the skull base to reach this point. But remember that the occipital condyle is divided into anterior, middle, and posterior 1/3. I would be hesitant to remove more than 50% of the occipital condyle. Okay, anything more than that would probably destabilize, or most likely destabilize the Atlanta occipital joint. So 1/3, maybe a little bit more than 1/3 is all that I would venture. If you want to dissect or resect more than 2/3 of the occipital condyle, then you better be prepared for a atlant-occipital joint fixation procedure as well, and this has to be all planned before surgery. Again, point of interest is always the posterior border, because we don't want to get into these anterior borders, because we're climbing up the clivus, we're getting into the foramen magnum, hypoglossal canal itself is there. I would not venture surely anterior to the hypoglossal canal and after seeing the nerve. That's for me the limit, at least in my hands, the limit for infratemporal fossa approach. So how do you know where you're going? You need to identify the posterior aspect of the jugular bulb, and then know the relation between the posterior aspect of the jugular foramen to the posterior point of the occipital condyle. Also the lateral exit point of the hypoglossal canal to the posterior point of the occipital condyle, and then surely the medial entry point of the hypoglossal nerve to the posterior point of the occipital condyle. So these three dimensions are to be mapped in your brain, and these are all things you need to identify during your resections. Now, a couple of very interesting points, so here I will also touch upon the history. See, I will just speak my mind. I will not be bothered by the constraints of time, because as I told you, this will be a series of lectures. Am I right, Puya? So we can go a little leisurely, and you will let me be a little liberal on my thoughts, I hope. Is it okay, Puya? Okay, so we will be having a series of these lectures. So let me go a little bit in detail about some of these finer aspects of the pathology of paragangliomas. Now, look at this picture very, very carefully. Okay, look at this picture. So this is again the same picture. You have the jugular spine here. You have the jugular foramen, the dome of the jugular bulb area, the jugular foramen area. This is the occipital condyle itself. The hypoglossal canal is here. Anterior to the jugular bulb is the carotid. We discussed this yesterday. Okay, so the petrous bone is here. So this is the eustachian tube area, the foramen spinosum, foramen ovale, and the greater wing of sphenoid is here. This is the tympanic bone. The tympanic bone for me is the gateway to lateral skull base surgery. The entire tympanic bone has to be removed so that you decap or uncap the lateral wall of the carotid canal, the jugular bulb, and also the stylomastoid foramen. So the styloid process is part of the tympanic bone, and removing the tympanic bone in its entirety exposes yourself to the three most vital structures: the facial nerve, the jugular foramen, and the carotid canal. So now look carefully at this point. This point here is the inferior tympanic canaliculus. Very interesting for me. See, the inferior tympanic canaliculus houses the inferior tympanic artery. I put this on top here, and it also houses the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is famously known as Jacobson's nerve, and I'm sure there is no ENT surgeon of worth who has not heard of the Jacobson's nerve. Now, the Jacobson's nerve is a parasympathetic nerve, and this nerve, along with the inferior tympanic artery, which is a branch of the ascending pharyngeal artery, enter this small canal called the inferior tympanic canaliculus, which lies between the carotid canal and the jugular foramen. Okay, so we are looking at this point here. Okay, why is this important? I need to touch upon history. Now, in 1840, Valentin, these are all physicians, scientists of the year, observed a small cellular formation near the origin of the tympanic nerve that has been identified as ganglionic tissue, and termed it ganglionum tympanicum, or intumescentia gangliosa. Okay, so he identified a ganglionic tissue near the origin of the tympanic nerve, that is around this point during his dissections. That was in 1840. In 1878, Cross further demonstrated highly vascular glomus tissue. So that vascular ganglionic tissue and a little bit of glomus tissue was found along the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve, again at this point itself. Okay, so at this point, Valentin and Cross discovered anatomically ganglions of the glossopharyngeal nerve and glomus tissues adjacent to it. Okay, and we all know that paragangliomas are glomus paraganglionic cell rests, normal cell rests. They arise, paragangliomas are tumors that arise from paraganglionic cell rests, which are glomus-like bodies found adjacent to paraganglion. Ganglions of which nerves? 9th, 10th, 11th, all the cranial nerves, most commonly the 9th cranial nerve, okay, and also the 10th. So, further demonstrate highly vascular glomus tissue along the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve. So, I told you the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve. So that was histologically similar to the carotid body as discovered by von Luschka in 1862. So a lot of work regarding glomus tissues, glomus tumors, glomus tissues was being done around the 1840s to 1870s or 1880s. In 1941, Gill described glomus tissue as a flattened overt body in the advent tissue of the dome of the jugular bulb. So the dome of the jugular bulb. So there were a few glomus tissues that were identified at the dome of the jugular bulb. And he coined the term glomus jugularis to describe paraganglionic tissue, ganglion of the 9th cranial nerve, composed of capillary or precapillary. Okay, so all this is, and then he found that 50% of this tissue occurred in the jugular bulb, okay, the dome of the jugular bulb here, and the remaining 50%, out of that, 25% occurred along the course of the point where we were discussing the inferior tympanic artery, the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve, that is Jacobson's nerve, and another 25% occurred along the auricular branch of the vagus. So we know that the spine divides the jugular foramen into anteromedial, glossopharyngeal compartment, and posterolateral. The other two nerves, the vagus nerve and the 10th and the 11th, the spinal axis nerve come out of the posterolateral triangle. So the vagus nerve is also not too far off. So 25% occurred along the auricular branch of the vagus, Arnold's nerve. So now we know by this historical nugget, we now know why there are 3 types of paragangliomas. Okay, one is paraganglioma arising from the dome of the jugular bulb as described by Gill in 1941. This is what is known as tympanojugular paraganglioma, the red dot. Then we know that there is tympanomastoid paraganglioma, that is described by Valentin and Cross. They both said that there are glomus-like tissues that go along the parasympathetic nerve, that's the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve. So the second set of tumor, now we know why they go into the middle ear. They don't involve the bulb per se, and they are more in the middle ear cleft, and they are called tympanomastoid paragangliomas. And the third group of tumors is that 25% that occurred along the auricular branch of the vagus, and that is those are the vagal paragangliomas. This I'm sorry, has this green dot has to come here. I'll do that right now because otherwise I will forget. Okay, so the third green dot is in this area. Okay, so these are the origins of the 3 types of paragangliomas that involve the jugular bulb. Now, what I will do is to take you through a dissection video, and then I'll come back to the diagrammatic depictions of the infratemporal foci approach. Now, this is an infratemporal foci approach dissection that I did in the national conference. I was invited as a faculty of the national conference of the Turkish Association of ENT Surgeons. This is a fairly, it was recorded well, so I thought I'll show this dissection and take you through the steps of infratemporal foci approach. Now, the incision is cranio-temporo-cervical. Okay, at this point, I'm just putting the cranio-temporal part of the incision, which will be then extended along the vertical limb, is extended along the what do you call the upper skin crease. Okay, so that neck extension I generally try to merge it with the upper skin crease, and then we get this incision. So let's go ahead with this part. Now the skin and the subcutaneous tissue are elevated in in one plane. Remember that it is always wise to have a thick lower flap and a slightly thinner upper flap. Okay, so I prefer to have the skin and subcutaneous tissue in one plane. So when I'm elevating, I look for this yellow tissue, and the shadow of this yellow should be seen for me. Anything, if I take another layer, and what is the next layer? The temporoparietal fascia and other fascia over the temporalis fascia and other fascia of the muscles, then this yellow tinge won't be there. Okay, which means that you've taken a little bit of flesh of the lower flap, and for me that's no good, because the lower flap needs to be sutured in a watertight fashion, so that, and that's the first line of defense against any CSF leak. It doesn't, of course, but you should take care not to penetrate through the skin and the subcutaneous fascia. Now, so you get into the more anterior parts, the temporalis fascia. This is where you get in as an otologist. You get into this so-called loose areolar tissue area, and you go ahead and make a cut through the external aortic canal. Now this is kind of edited to 12 minutes, and we're going to go fast. A lot of nuances in infratemporal fossa approach. Again, not something that can be covered in one topic today, in one go today, but this sectioning of the external aortic canal has to be done correctly. It should not be too lateral, it should not be too medial. If you go too medial, you get into very thin external aortic canal skin. If you go too lateral, you get through the conchal cartilage, and it becomes very difficult to then suture the blind sac closure. So I prefer to actually mark this from inside the ear. I turn the ear, put an oral speculum, I go inside the ear, I mark the point, which is a couple of millimeters lateral to the bony cartilaginous junction, and I make an incision. I make a incision from inside, and then I come out, and when I when I'm at this point, I know where I'm supposed to get into, at which point I'm supposed to get into in the external ear canal. But here we are going fast, and then we do a second layer, second flap. We are doing a we are raising the musculoperiosteal flap. Now this flap has to be raised. Now we don't have cautery, but in the operation theater, I would use a monopolar cautery and remove every so this flap that I'm pulling behind with my finger is nice and thick. So all this is done hugging the bone. Okay, and when I'm doing that, I will also harvest a little bit of perichondrium to later on close the Eustachian tube. The blind sac closure is a fundamental principal step in all major skull-base surgeries. Okay, beginning from subtotal vitrectomy, infratemporal fossa type A, type B, type C and D. Probably we can type D we can avoid because it's a preauricular approach. But in many of the transaortic approach, one has to close because you're going to leave a fairly big cavity, and that's not going to you cannot leave that cavity open. Okay, so once you have elevated this posterior flap, superior flap, anterior flap, you then get into the neck. While doing this, care should be taken. See, some of these steps might not reflect true surgical dissections, because this dissection had time constraints. We had to do it in a big hall, and so I might go quickly in some areas to show the more vital parts of the dissections. But remember, when you're doing the posterior flap, you then start elevating the sternocleidomastoid muscle along with this posterior flap. Okay, so this sternocleidomastoid and the musculoperiosteal flap, all of that come together in one flap. Okay, now, okay, so what else goes behind? You see that the mastoid tip is completely exposed. So you not only take this sternocleidomastoid out, you also, all this is done with a monopolar cautery like this. You take the splenius capitis, you can go up to the semispinalis capitis, you also take the longissimus capitis. All those muscles come out as you go posteriorly and medially. And this is the posterior suboccipital triangle area. There's a lot of fat, which generally I dissect this fat out because you often get lymph nodes, and you never know if one of those lymph nodes turn out to be positive. You might be looking at a malignant paraganglioma. And in paragangliomas, remember, the term malignant used in association with paraganglioma does not denote malignancy like in head and neck malignancy, other malignancy, which means that it does not mean that this is a spreading tumor. It is just that there is another foci outside the primary area of foci, which it does not really correspond to the term malignant in, let's say, a squamous cell carcinoma. So a case in point is that I had a patient from Bangladesh who had a huge paraganglioma, a young lady who also had a 2-3 millimeter lesion in the cerebellum. Okay, now that lesion grew. I did a surgery. So it was a fairly big tumor, extradural, intradural. So I did an extradural resection. Intradurally kept it for the next stage, hoping to probably team up with the neurosurgeon to remove the cerebellar component as well. But later on, the patient obviously financial constraints, So this cerebellar component grew, and this lady is still alive and she's okay, but the cerebellar component has grown significantly up to close to about 0.5 centimeter or something in about 2 years time at least. So now this is also metastatic paraganglioma, but it does not necessarily mean that this is not really the same as cerebellum or intracranial metastasis in case of a squamous cell carcinoma. Anyway, so this is the posterior part. The first structure that you identify when you get into the neck is the digastric muscle. Okay, so we're coming to that later. Now we are going to do a blind sac. The blind sac is not shown here. I'm beginning with the mastectomy here. This is an edited video. So again, mastectomy is always wide. I begin from laterally, hugging the middle fossa dural plate. In this case, the middle fossa dural plate has to be maintained. We don't need to remove the middle fossa because the dissection is all from this point downwards, from the labyrinthine block downwards. Now, you may ask me, why am I preserving the canal wall? Just for kicks, no apparent reason. I prefer to maintain the canal wall. In a lot of cases, just like that. So I get a few landmarks. I see the facial, I get a nice anatomy. The semicircular canals identified here, lateral canal, posterior canal. The facial nerve is now coming into view. The epitympanotomy is being performed. I do a fairly wide epitympanotomy, even in normal circumstances mostly. And now I'm removing the posterior canal wall. So the whole thing, okay, let's go through this. Nothing great about this. So I know where my facial is, so I'm confidently, drilling above the facial. I told you never go perpendicular to the facial. This is a cadaveric dissection. Even in a cadaveric dissection, don't do that. Go always parallel to the posterior canal wall. Remove all this bone, create a groove in the root of the zygoma for you to eventually see, this is the groove that you create in the root of the zygoma to eventually reroot and put the rerouted nerve back in its place. Now I've brought down the canal wall. I'm removing the ossicles. I'm removing the tympanomeatal flap. The skin is removed completely. Now it's very important that you remove every bit of epithelium. You might remove the whole tumor. You might do heroic stuff, go all around jugula foramen, but if you do a simple mistake of not clearing off the annulus adequately here, you will be responsible for a iatrogenic cholestoma that grows later on in this same cavity that you've created for during removal of the disease. So now I'm separating the infratemporal fossa soft tissue, which is nothing but the parotid gland and the temporomandibular joint and the ascending ramus of mandible area. I'm removing all that. I'm pushing that forward, and to be able to remove the tympanic bone in its entirety. This is one procedure where the entire tympanic bone has to be removed. I'm coming close to the facial now. I'm still using a cutting burr. I always prefer to use a cutting burr till I'm fairly close to the facial now. And then I use the diamond burr. Now I'm exposing the facial nerve. You see, drilling on the nerve very gently in a normal way. You see the nerve is intact, not damaged at all by any standards. So when you're doing this in a surgical field, in live surgery, you'll encounter bleeding. Okay, the stylomastoid branch, stylomastoid artery goes along with the facial nerve, and then it goes and gives branches. The artery stapedius is all given in this area, so it generally bleeds a little in this part. At this part, it bleeds exactly where I'm elevating the facial nerve. I don't hold it with this. I don't hold it with any instrument. The nerve is not held like that. This is again anatomical dissections. And to speeden up things, we do that. Otherwise, a fish hook or any the flag knife or whatever one of these structures can be. Fish hook is what I usually use, is used to reroute the nerve in its entirety all the way up to the geniculate ganglia. Now this is possible. There are a few points in rerouting. Rerouting will be easy, complete, and perfect if you follow the more distal parts of the facial nerve up to the bifurcation of the parotid. Here I have not followed it because generally in anatomical specimens, the parotid will be liquefied, and to find the nerves will be a little difficult unless it's a very fresh specimen. So here I can easily pluck out the whole of the parotid. So from it, but otherwise in surgery, it's always wise to go up to the parotid to the facial bifurcation of the parotid and medially up to the geniculate ganglia. But make sure you don't damage the blood supply area in the area of the geniculate ganglia, because you've already sacrificed one. The facial nerve results will be good only if you preserve this. Okay, so where are you going to reroute it and place it? You're going to place it in this groove that you just drilled along the root of the zygoma. Okay, so you're not cutting it. Oh, I'm cutting it only because I didn't have anything to hold the nerve in place. I didn't have tissue glue, I didn't have sutures, and I had to go through the dissection. So otherwise what you do is you keep this nerve held in position like this. You also suture the parotid, take some sutures and pull the parotid upwards to take this nerve completely out of your dissecting field. And you use a couple of sutures and use tissue glue to hold this rerouted nerve in this place. Okay, now let's go into, once the rerouting is done, you start, the next step is to drill out the rest of the tympanic bone here, and in the process identify the one and only styloid process. You see this immediately. Once you reroute, you see the fairly long styloid process in this case, and attached to the styloid process, the muscles of the styloid process. Now that's the tip of the styloid process. I always, now you see what I just turned around. I just held something there. Now remember that just medial to the styloid process will be the external carotid artery, the terminal branch of which gets into the parotid. Okay, so the external carotid artery getting into the parotid will just be medial. So don't be too aggressive in this. And I have learned it by, by an error. So if you are cautery, you may nick the external carotid artery. Nothing happens. I mean, it's external, not the internal carotid artery, but make sure that you do not go too far. Hug the styloid, be safe, remove all the muscles, push the muscles down, isolate the entire styloid process, and now drill whatever is left of the tympanic bone. Okay, that's how you, so now we're drilling the entire tympanic bone, and now we're looking at this area, the jugulosigmoid junction. So you're ready to expose the jugular bulb, you're ready to expose the carotid. The only part of the tympanic bone is the styloid bone, the small part on this thing, and a little bit of bone on the jugular bulb. This is already the jugular bulb here. Okay, and now you go drilling. Once you've drilled, you identify, now what have you identified? You've identified the jugular bulb. Okay, so this is the jugular bulb, this is the shadow of the carotid, labyrinthine block is intact, pre-sigmoid dura exposed, sigmoid sinus more or less exposed, post-sigmoid, retrosigmoid not necessary, but this is now the jugular process. This is the area you'll have to drill out to get into the more deeper areas. Okay, so now what I'm doing is, and to drill out the jugular process, you'll have to actually remove all the muscular attachment of the skull base, which includes the rectus muscles, and you need to expose. So the jugular bulb is nicely exposed. Some piece of bone here, again tympanic bone only. Okay, because still the carotid canal is still tympanic bone, and that is why the styloid is still in its place. And here we are detaching the last parts of the tympanic bone from the styloid, and the styloid is completely mobilized and resected out. Okay, now if you look at this, this is the base of the skull. Okay, the undersurface of the petrous, occipital bone, whatever bones that you've been listening to me so far. Okay, so this is the base of the skull, undersurface of the base of the skull. Okay, now we resect the styloid process. By doing so, we are now completely in control of the carotid. Just under the styloid, you get the carotid. Okay, do a little bit of dissection and you'll find the carotid. But in the normal specimen, this is not so easy because this is all where the tumor will be. Okay, this is all where the tumor will be. This whole area, trust me, this whole area will be covered by tumor like this. In a fairly big, I'm not talking about C2, C1, C3, C4. This whole area here is covered by tumor, sometimes going into the mastoid, all these areas. Okay. Now we are identifying the IJV, the interjugular vein. This is the 11th cranial nerve crossing the IJV. You cut the IJV, obviously using vascular clips, not like this. This is the IJV, okay, which is being cut. That's the 11th cranial nerve, the spinal axillary nerve, which is lateral. In 80% of the cases, it's lateral. Then you bring it down, and this will all have tumor inside. And then you go forward. So one side you've cut. I'm showing you the lumen of the IJV. Okay, so that's the lumen of the IJV. Trust me, it's the IJV. And then you now have to close the tap from above. So you close the sigmoid sinus by doing a extraluminal packing. So you close here, you close here. How do you repair your plumbing? If you have to change your pipe, you'll have to block the two ends and put a new pipe in between, isn't it? Here there is no putting of a new pipe. Here there is just closing of the pipe. The sigmoid is closed by using Surgicel. Here I'm using a cotton gauze, but you use a Surgicel and close the sigmoid extraluminally, and if necessary only intraluminally. Generally it's not necessary. I close this in two places, one above, one below. I do another eye line here. You see here, I close this also. So sigmoid is 100% closed. Now you see the jugular bulb here. Okay, IJV is closed, tumor here, jugular bulb here, sigmoid is closed above. Now I'm attacking the carotid. I'm exposing I'm drilling anterior to the carotid. This is the carotid here. I'm drilling anterior to the carotid, area of the Eustachian tube. Okay, now I'm exposing the jugular bulb to show it's the internal wall of the medial wall of the jugular bulb in all its glory. You see this? This is where I cut the IJV. Now this is one of the openings, most likely to be the inferior petrosal sinus. Sometimes the inferior petrosal sinus can be outside the skull base. Okay, so this is fairly big, which means it's inferior petrosal sinus. There is the anterior and posterior condylar veins, which open into these areas, anterior and posterior condylar veins. Now I'm finding the groove between the IJV and the carotid. So that's the carotid. Immediately medial, okay, is the carotid. So that you have to look for the carotid, dissect for the carotid like this. There is a thick fibrocartilaginous area at the junction of the carotid canal entry, jugular bulb entry. So you'll have to, this will be all difficult areas to resect because some of it will be involved by tumor, some of it is anatomically quite tough. So it is quite tricky to be dissecting in these areas. But here you see that the jugular bulb has been opened. This is the dome of the jugular bulb. The medial wall of the jugular bulb is preserved. Now I'm doing carotid dissection. Somewhere here, you will find the 9th cranial nerve. I think it's here. You can see the 9th cranial nerve crossing the internal carotid artery. The internal carotid artery, the 9th cranial nerve or the glossopharyngeal nerve crosses the carotid quite above, high above. So I'm going now, drilling anterior to the carotid. I'm always using a diamond burr around the carotid, a big diamond burr posterior to the carotid in an attempt to now reroute the carotid. See, the cochlea is still intact. Okay, the cochlea is still intact. Now I'm going along the greater wing of sphenoid area. I have gone quite deep here. Now you can combine the carotid. This is all infratemporal fossa type A. You can combine it with the type B, type C and all by now drilling along the greater wing of sphenoid, which is more anteriorly here. Okay, this is more anterior. Okay, for that you need to use a cutting burr. It's not enough to use a diamond. But the carotid is ready to be transferred if necessary, but generally it's not necessary to always transpose the carotid. So carotid is here, jugular bulb is here. This is now the jugular process, which needs to be drilled posterior to the jugulosigmoid complex. You drill it with a cutting burr because it's a big chunk of bone till you reach the hypoglossal canal. Now, this is the hypoglossal canal. You have drilled the entire to reach the hypoglossal canal. Okay, you need to drill a little more. I think I had very little time, so I didn't get into the jugular bulb areas. Okay, so I now moved into vertebral artery dissection. Now this is the lateral process of the C1 transverse process. Now this is the arch. This is the vertebral artery. Now this is all beyond the scope of this discussion. I'm doing a vertebral artery dissection. I'm doing what is called a far lateral approach. I'm drilling out the arch of the transverse process of C1. and I'm going to the vertebral artery. So this is the whole vertebral artery. So all this, so I'm completely transposing the vertebral artery. This is another subject altogether, far lateral, suboccipital, extreme lateral approaches. All this is a part of vertebral artery exposure. So where does the vertebral artery go? Gets into the foramen magnum, isn't it? So how close are we? We are very close. If I just remove this bone here, and then all this can be one big specimen. Okay, so this is anatomical dissection of infratemporal fossa. I just cut the vertebral artery to show the lumen of the vertebral artery here. Then the C1 nerve, C2, all that is all in relation to the vertebral artery. We'll talk about it some other day. Now, Pooya, do we have time, or are we over and done with?
I think that we're a little bit late.
Yes. Okay. Right. So
we
right.
we will proceed for the futures meeting, which are
Yeah.
going to be provided in the next few weeks, or might be probably the next one. It depends
Yes.
on your schedule.
Yes.
We will make an announcement. We will try to be stitched to the timetable, but due to the fact that Zoom application has been usually worldwide on this time, even if we started to using Zoom since 2 years and we have our preferred line, however, there's some issues going on and they do have to update. So we will figure it out and we will soon. So I do think that for the next meeting, you could present from this moment ahead to reach and focus on the approach on a B. So for anyone interested to get more confident for the approach type B, I would recommend to share and once again be prepared for the next step. But this is going just to happen if you already have the clear vision of the type A. So you have to watch these seminar to be able to attend for the next one. So thank you, Sampath, and of course I really would like to thank Kavita Prakapalet for the brief introduction, and thank you once again. And I hope that everyone will be attend the next one. For anyone that missed this one, will be available on a Facebook channel, and also we will try to provide it on our YouTube channel. We are working to provide also podcasts, as many of our subscribers know. Some of them has already been uploaded on our Spotify channel or Google's, and you can also hear that. However, for the next one, we have to wait a little bit to get permission to upload it on Spotify. So thank you both of you for your presentation and for your time. Of course, 2 hours is very precious right now. So I am really glad that you did this brilliant presentation. So we will probably today, tomorrow, or in 2 days, we will be able to provide an effective date for the upcoming events. Okay?
Sure, Pooya. Looking forward for the next lecture, and thanks again for the opportunity. And you've always been wonderful and very supportive of me. Thanks. I really appreciate your efforts and our relationship. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you too, because our association and the Skull-Based Foundation is established connection since many years, and I do think that we are doing great. Thank you once again for all the attendees, and we will see you, and we will provide all the information on our Facebook and social networks. Thank you again, and have a good night. Bye bye.
Thanks, Pooya. Good night. Bye bye.